My name is Katrina. I'm an undergraduate student here at Western and a co-organizer of the event today. I first met Camille on Zoom over the summer when I was doing consultations for this event. We weren't exactly sure then what the event would look like, but we knew that it had to be a conversation between the university and the London community. It was emphasized to me very early on by multiple people that Camille was someone I absolutely needed to talk to in order to get this event right. As soon as we began chatting over Zoom, I immediately understood why. Her passion for art and refusal to be boxed into any one group radiated off the screen. Not only that, but she did as an undergraduate student at Western what so many other students are unwilling to do: take 2 buses to East London to watch theater. I told Josh immediately after I met Camille that she had anarchist energy. So it only makes sense that her talk today is titled, "Can the Public Arts and the University Get Along? A Talk for the Traumatized." A Hamilton-born and Toronto-based multidisciplinary artist and researcher, Camille has accomplished a lot since she graduated from Western back in 2019, and we are so excited to welcome her back to our campus. Give it up for Camille.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here in community today. You know, it's both strange and a pleasure to be here in my old stomping ground, good old Weldon Library, at an event hosted by WordsFest, which I've attended and spoken at in many capacities for many years in a pre-pandemic world. And so I want to thank Josh, first of all, and Katrina for the invitation and for that very beautiful introduction, and as well as everyone involved in putting this event together and its facilitation. And also, I would just like to say thank you for that note about, Palestine, because as artists and academics and institutional leaders, I believe we do have a responsibility to use our voices and platforms and put pressure on our political leaders to take action. So thank you. I know how much goes into organizing and planning and pulling off something like this. So hats off to everyone involved. I see a lot of people in Words t-shirts in the back. Thank you for being here. Thank everyone for being wonderful. So I want to start this off with a little story. 8 years ago, this was me. I was a first-year arts and humanities student here at Western. I'd actually come for political science against literally all of my best instincts, impulses, passions, and interests. But I switched my degree about 2 months into classes when I realized that honestly, the most intellectually and emotionally stimulated I was at this university was in my enriched introduction to English literature class taught by Dr. David Bentley. And I knew I was an artist. I became an arts major. I never looked back. And it was St. Patrick's Day, and all of my friends were out at some, first year St. Patrick's Day party. And I was at Museum London because I had heard about a talk hosted by Gillian Kiley, who in this really beautiful, fortuitous, full circle moment, as we know, is the other keynote presenter at this event later today. And that talk of Gillian's was called "Making the Performing Arts Thrive Locally, Regionally, and Nationally." And in it, she talked a little bit about being from St. John's and how she brought little pieces of Newfoundland with her into every show that she directs. And I believe at the time she was working on a piece for the Stratford Festival. And Gillian said, quoting Michel Tremblay, "To be universal, we must be local." And boy, did that hit home for my little underdeveloped, weird teenage artist brain. It was something that was really important for me to hear, and it was so formative. And now I was a writer then. I've always been a writer and a storyteller in some capacity, but I didn't know that 8 years later I'd be doing it professionally to the extent that I am now. And at that age, all I wanted to do was write about big and serious ideas, because that's what big and serious writers do. And besides, who wants to write about Ontario? But I had a real change of heart that night with Gillian's talk, and I've since embraced Southern Ontarian poetics in my work as a playwright and multidisciplinary artist and a singer-songwriter. And yes, that means I've written a little bit about London too. So after that talk, I went home and I did what every normal neurotypical teenager does on St. Patrick's Day. I went home and wrote a blog post about it. And I published it and I tweeted about it. And in this blog post, I was kind of extending Kylie's ideas to think about my own local environment and the artistic communities I saw thriving in it. I wrote about the importance of honing in on the specificity of time and place and the significance of the local to all of my favorite writers, both contemporary and not. And I wrote, I'm going to read a quote from this, quote, "We so often undermine the work in our community for New York City and traveling musical theater companies coming to Toronto. But how can we ever expect the arts to thrive in our communities if we are not in constant support of them? If we do not dare to create in our home cities or use our immediate environments as inspiration, then how are we ever to achieve this universality, italicized, in our art? And then later on I say, quote, "It's not until you come to university that you realize how little you know and how little you'll probably always know," unquote. Yeah, I don't snap for that. I just turned 19. Now, I'm not saying everyone should go and be like me and sacrifice formative social events for talks at a museum. I'm just saying that it kind of worked out in my favor because after posting this article, I got an enthusiastic email from Josh expressing interest in what I'd written and inviting me to chat further with him about the public humanities here at Western. And that would become the start of a very long and fulfilling conversation between us. So why do I tell this story? Well, first of all, that talk and really that whole first year at Western and in the arts and humanities faculty really set the stage, pun intended, for what would become the start of my career as a community engaged multidisciplinary artist, playwright, and musician, and now a public scholar and educator, whatever that means. It was here in London that the building blocks of my career were set. Trip down memory lane. First plays I ever wrote were for the Purple Shorts Festival at what was formerly Theatre Western. I believe it's now Theatre USC. The first professional gig I ever had was as a theater artist was at the Grand Theatre Playwrights Cabaret, which I was a part of when I think I was about 20 or 21. I directed Antigone at the Arts Project. I participated in Tinker Space Play Labs. I was student writer in residence here at Western. I was a studio artist in residence at the TAP Center for Creativity. Sandra's here. Hi, Sandra. I did Words Fest for many years. I worked at Filthy Rabina Vintage. And if anyone followed their social media years ago, I had a Parisian persona named Mona who I would like do ads with. It was a whole situation. But I took part in a lot of different workshops and readings and showcases in this community. And keep in mind, this was all in a pre-COVID era. And obviously I took a break from my public practices when we were all in lockdown. But now, I mean, this is me now. I'm working professionally with a bunch of theaters where I've got some work in development, namely Tarragon, Studio 180, musical stage company, Cahoots in the Theater Center. And my work has also been supported by Pat the Dog Theater Creation, where Lisa O'Connell, who's the artistic director, funny enough, was my first dramaturg at the Grand so many years ago. Greenlight Arts, Nightwood, Theater Aquarius, Expect Theater, Tottering Biped. I've been honestly very stupidly fortunate in the past couple of years, but at the same time, I've been undertaking a PhD at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information, which was a decision that was almost entirely made because the world shut down during COVID and I literally had nothing else to do. So I went to grad school. And it was really the pandemic that thrust me into the open arms of the academy when I'd already made the decision for myself that I didn't think that I wanted to do a doctorate yet or ever. So that's also what I've been doing. I've been teaching undergrad and postgrad classes at University of Toronto, Scarborough, and St. George campuses. I've been attending and presenting at conferences, navigating academia treacherously, and bouncing back and forth between being a community engaged artist and an interdisciplinary scholar. And I guess the tensions of that are what I'm here to talk about today. So that's my favorite slide. Now, when I was approached and invited to come do this event, I warned you, Josh, I had two major thoughts. Thought number one was, oh my God, Jillian Kiley's here. I have to start with the blog post story. That'll be good. That'll go over well. And two, how am I going to diplomatically, but also honestly speak to this very difficult, at least in my mind, very complicated question that Josh asked me to talk about of how the theater or the public arts and the community and a university can build intentional points of contact in productive ways. Because as a professional working artist with, let's say, a colorful history through post-secondary education, which is to say I got my BA here at Western. I got a master's degree from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, which is a performing arts conservatory in London, in the UK. And I have a PhD in the womb. I have literally made a career out of struggling through this question. And I've carved out opportunities for myself to see my artistic and scholarly practices as conversational, but not without immense trauma and pain points and existential crises. And honestly, a deep reckoning with what it means to be like institutionalized or to be a product of a specific institution. This is where I guess the anarchist stuff comes in. And furthermore, my gut reaction to even hearing this prompt about the arts in the university is like, well, they can't speak to each other perfectly. There are ways in which they just don't. And that's that's okay. But surely I can't say that in my talk, can I? No, I should be utopian in my community mindedness. I need to stand in front of however many people, thanks for coming out, at Weldon Library, where I used to fall asleep writing mediocre essays on Chaucer and Judith Butler not even 5 years ago, and say, I, Camille Intson, have identified these perfect reciprocal streams of conversation between the public arts and the university, so let me tell you all about them in a rigorously structured and sensical manner. As I was writing this portion of my talk in my Toronto apartment, my sweet, wonderful, fluffy cat, Leo, jumped on my bright orange couch. Yeah, he's really cute. Beside me and meowed in my face, as if to say, hey, Mom, I think you're sounding a little bit traumatized here. And maybe Leo's onto something. And maybe this relationship between the public or the community engaged arts and the university is one of trauma. Maybe there is trauma in this conversation. So let me explain what I mean by that. Trauma. Like many bright-eyed undergraduate students, I learned about trauma from this guy, Mr. Sigmund Freud. I know, I know. But among other problematic things, to say the least, Freud teaches us that the history of trauma turns our body into a text that is read. Trauma functions as a structure, as an economy that sustains itself through its cyclical nature. So now I invite you, dear audience, to read my traumatized body like a text. So when I think about my own trauma in relation to this conversation, I think about a few things. I think about academic writing classes making me hate my own writing because I felt like putting a numerical grade on a piece of creative work actually did violence to my process. It foreclosed a language or a new idea or an experimental way of writing or thinking just as it was expressed in its rough draft form in an academic classroom. I think about an old grad school supervisor, this is where I throw some shade, telling me that I'd be a failure as an artist and as a scholar if I pursued both of those things concurrently, and then making sly comments about work I was pursuing outside of the academy. I think about my old playwriting instructor in grad school who told me I wasn't a writer because he thought I didn't have the personality for it and that he couldn't imagine me sitting down and writing anything by myself. Shockingly, the men in my class did not get that comment. I think about people I work with in the arts who actually judge my involvement with the academy, who make automatic assumptions about me based on their own assumptions that I'm going to be real, are sometimes correct about what people in academia are like. I think about people in higher education who don't see art, or more specifically my art, as a serious field of inquiry, who think all artists are broke hobbyists that are intellectually inferior to the work being done at the university level. I also think about the experiences of my female friends, of my gender nonconforming friends, of my racialized friends who are treated a lot differently by institutions than cis straight white dudes. And then, of course, I think about COVID. I think about the damage that it did to our arts ecosystem and specifically to our ability to create and sustain community. I know that the university and the community engaged arts feel that deeply. And for a while there, like for me, the only work I could get was at and with the university. And that made me deeply sad because I realized that ultimately the structures that the university has in place, financial and otherwise, made it possible to jumpstart my career as an academic. Meanwhile, other artistic institutions couldn't sustain me as an artist. That's a lot of trauma. I have so many of these stories, and now I know I'm young, but I've spent my whole professional career being told that I can't be in both spaces, academic and artistic, precisely because they don't have different values that don't see eye to eye, because they have different values that don't see eye to eye. And I'm far from the only person with this experience. I've been in so many conversations with other artists turned academics who engage in various forms of artistic research, practitioner researchers, all kinds of these people all over the world that I've been in community with. And amongst almost all of them, this trauma exists and persists. Okay, so like, what do I do with that? What do we collectively do with the fact that a lot of artists and academics don't gel with each other for very legit reasons? We both feel unwelcome or judged, or like we're somehow not enough in the opposite space. And when people working in those spaces reinforce that divide, it almost forecloses the need for connection. And I do believe that there is the need for connection between us, especially if the humanities or if the liberal arts are to survive and prosper in this economy. Now, we've all heard that the humanities are dead or in crisis. Hands up to anyone who's heard that the arts are in crisis, that the humanities are dying. Yeah. Budget cuts, a precarious job market, unstable income, sometimes outdated or irrelevant curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. These are stories, some myths, but also arguably some truths that we've all come in contact with and that we've sort of learned to contend with. But for what it's worth, the humanities are not dead. Literally open the news. Go on TikTok if that's more your thing. Critical discourse is everywhere. Creative methods for mediating and communicating that critical discourse, those are everywhere too. And they all require the kind of critical thinking that humanities classrooms or the arts in general breed. Media literacy is becoming super important in an age of mass propaganda, where encountering AI-generated text and audio and images is becoming commonplace. We need humanities education to parse through the most important critical questions, literally, of our age. So the problem is not that the humanities are dead, it's that the humanities have to adapt. I actually don't think we have a choice but to adapt. And that can mean so many different things, whether methodologically or structurally, or in terms of curriculum and content taught. But it also means reckoning with a mold for humanities education that has its roots in white and colonial capitalist imperial interests. It means looking the old guard of the humanities in the face and going, sir, we need a makeover. And this thought applies duly to academic and artistic institutions. So when I say this conversation is traumatized, I don't mean that it's devoid of possibilities. As a matter of fact, and for the academics in the room, here's my thesis. I think that in working from a place of trauma, and specifically from non-innocence, and I'll tell you what that is later, we can actually welcome new possibilities of connection between the university and the community, accountably, ethically, and tactfully. And I think that starts with asking ourselves this question: what makes the university hostile to the public arts, and maybe vice versa? Because here's what I think. I think there are obvious ways in which institutionally sanctioned methodologies and pedagogies, ways of writing and teaching and making and researching, fundamentally work against the arts or against artistic methods. So I'm going to discuss this now a little bit. Part 3, the university as a site of trauma. These are such dramatic headlines. Dramatic for a good reason. So in my thinking, the crux of this conversation goes back to Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang's work, which are 2 scholars who work in indigenous colonizing studies. And in the article, Our Words Refusing Research, which is phenomenal, they consider the relationship between research as a concept and ongoing forms of colonial violence. So because research is a concept that for a very long time was, but also still is, synonymous with imperialism and colonialism, it's a concept that's been used for centuries as a tool of colonial violence towards specifically indigenous populations. How do we move forward with ethical and accountable ways of doing research without dismissing the work that researchers do in the academy? So Tuck and Yang, they present a refusal to do research or a refusal within research as a way of thinking about humanizing researchers. So to unpack that a little bit, there is a growing body of literature around the idea of refusal, of refusing to call something research, because calling it research would subject it to institutional surveillance. And also how the idea of information openness, so information should always be open and publicly available and accessible, can be used against communities that need to be safeguarded and protected. So a lot of that work actually has roots in Black and Indigenous scholarship. So how is this relevant to working with art and artists? Question. Short answer, because art is also something that resists and refuses this thing that we call research. Even though, not only do artists do a lot of research, which could mean something different to them as it does to academics, arguably art itself is kind of a mode of research, right? It's a way of discovering something through creating something, but it's a mode of research that isn't fully captured by the institution or by methodologies that we sanction. Artists and academics, we do not share the same language for describing our process or our outputs. We value different things. We have different standards of excellence, of evaluation, sometimes taste. And that's not to romanticize art either. Art certainly has its institutions, and those institutions have their politics and their sometimes nefarious political engagements. So what happens when we try to welcome art as a thing, as a process, as a, let's say, potential mode of research into the university. The problems with artistic research. Now, if you're associated with a university or a higher learning institution, or even if not, you may have heard these terms: artistic research, practice-based research, research creation, practice as research. This is like the tip of the iceberg. There are literally so many of these terms that are geographically specific. All of these are terms, models for essentially justifying art as like a mode of research within the university. So why do these terms exist? Well, first of all, because artists started getting involved with modern universities. PhD programs in the arts started flaring up, and universities kind of had to adjust for the different methods that they were using. You know, in some ways, I think these concepts are awesome and really well-meaning, but if we look a little bit deeper into why they exist and their rationale. So Robin Nelson, who is a UK-based performance scholar, makes the point that learning institutions, so universities, typically recognize explicit and objective forms of knowledge, so like hard facts. But embodied knowledges or performative knowledges, for example, like subjective knowledges, are often subjugated and dismissed from spheres of research because they're just not serious enough. Put simply, the academy, at least traditionally, values fact and not feeling. And Nelson's point is that practice-based research, by making space to give voice or value to our subjective experiences, like the things that we work from when we're like being artists and creating art, as a way of doing research, is kind of a cool way of critiquing the academy from within it. But here's the problem with that, in my opinion. While critiquing the academy or academia, Nelson also acknowledges that there is a necessity for artistic research to, quote, demonstrate a rigor equivalent to that of the sciences. So what do? We make scientific-looking diagrams to attempt to pick apart the process. We try to identify and synthesize the different types of knowledges involved in an artistic research process. It makes it mathematical in a way. We use high concept academic terms like multi-mode epistemological model to assert, again, for the validation of an institution, that the process of making art is a serious mode of research that the university should accept and embrace. But like looking at this diagram, this is the question I asked myself in my master's program, like, who is this legible to? Who is it for? Who is it valuable to? And who is it conversational with? Is it accessible to people in our community that we want to be in conversation with? Do you go to a concert and think, does this kind of work properly capture the process and values of art making? So in my opinion, at least, there's a pretty big tension between what practice-based research preaches and what it values, and the desire for it to be institutionally valuable in the same way that the hard sciences are. And my honest thought is like, well, it's just not, and never will be valuable in that same exact way within the structures and standards that exist in modern universities. That's a comparison that actually sets it up for failure. When I started using these methods, when I tried to plug my work into this diagram to understand how my art practice was or could be research, I consistently felt like something in my work was lost in the fight for academic viability. And for me, those things were pleasure and play, two things that I think are really important to being an artist. Also, just to be super blunt and honest with you guys, when I first started engaging with like artistic research work at different universities, a lot of it felt kind of soulless to me. It felt like something that was made to pander to a system that is always already fundamentally working against the creative process, or like working against artists. So when I was trying to justify my own creative practices to the institution, when I was trying to make perfect lines between my art and my scholarship, I was unhappy in both my scholarly education and my professional art practice. I didn't feel like an artist or a scholar. I felt like both of those parts of me were actually actively suffering. So I keep those spaces now. Now, again, I'm not saying that I don't outright believe in these terms or in the work of making the academy a better space for artists. Of course, I think the academy should open its doors to artistic research methods, of course. But my big question there is like, how can we learn from these tensions and contradictions while still placing value in practice-based artistic research as a mode of institutional critique as well as resistance? So instead of making artists, pivot all their work and their languages and their methods and their values to appease the institution, I think that there has to be another way. Another way. So here's the question that drives this section. I'm a big on questions. You probably noticed I like questions. But how can we, as a community of academics and artists, build webs of relationality and reciprocal conversation between different spheres of inquiry and influence? That is a very jargony question, isn't it? Let's make that better. How can we, in the academy and in the community, productively talk to and really listen to each other? Active listening. For some ways forward, I'm going to turn to some Canadian scholars who I actually think are really onto something with this conversation. Owen Chapman and Kim Sawchuk, who write extensively about modalities, another academic word, different kinds of research creation, which is the Canadian term for practice-based artistic research, while also speaking to a lot of the tensions that I've spoken about in this talk so far. They talk about foregrounding family resemblances and the concept of an intervention in reckoning with art making within the university. So instead of thinking about art as, art must contribute to research knowledge in the academy, they challenge us to ask, on what levels can certain things be identified as an intervention? And this concept of intervention is really cool because it destabilizes academia's chokehold on what has traditionally constituted a research outcome. It also foregrounds an ethics of accountability to spheres of influence beyond the academy, which is, I think, exactly what we want to hit and where we want to go. When we bring the arts community and the university together, we don't just want to be just creating more ivory tower inaccessible research for the university that pervades and feeds into an elitist capitalist colonial economy. We want to be creating webs of relationality and connections and ultimately interventions into our world. We want to be producing results on multiple planes, making a difference in our communities and not just our institutions. So in a book on the subject that I personally really love called How to Make Art at the End of the World, a Manifesto for Research Creation, Natalie Lovelace, who is an artist and professor at the University of Alberta, theorizes a queer and a feminist approach to research creation as a site of institutional survival, sociality, world making, and transformation. Doesn't that sound seductive? It really does. And in that project, she theorizes this great concept of polydisciplinary. Hear me out, hear me out. So this concept of polydisciplinary, polyamory, but with disciplines, foregrounds mutual care and eros to imagine a radical, queer, and feminist university that is open to dialogue and conversation and collaboration beyond the academy. Pretty sick. And where she writes, here's another academic quote, in case there haven't been enough, where she writes that traditional interdisciplinarity, we hear that word so much, I feel like we've almost lost its meaning, could be said to be about who, which is to say which disciplines one commits to. Research creation as a polydisciplinarist orientation becomes about how one commits to producing new kinship ties. I love the idea of kinship ties, not only in terms of content, the who, but in terms of form, the how. So for Lovelace, it's not just about being committal to disciplines, not to furthering a very specific traditional, old guard of humanities education where we read white men in tortured silence and talk about Freud. And hey, that's not to blast it completely. I loved my English degree, I really did. But it's about committing to new kinship ties, maybe with other disciplines, maybe with people outside of the academy. It's not just about how we're learning. Hold on a minute. It's not just about what we're learning, but how we're learning it. There we go. That's the quote I wanted to say. And again, to return to this thesis about trauma, this polydisciplinarist care and community-oriented work can't really fully materialize without acknowledging that we are working from a place of ongoing tension and trauma. When Lovelace says that this approach is a site of institutional survival, the insinuation would be that we need new ways of surviving within the institution, within institutional structures, and that we as artists, but also as people, are not already surviving well. So whether the issue is pedagogical in terms of what we're learning, how we're learning it, as I've dedicated way too much time to already, or the fact that the university needs to, I think, kind of keep up with the way that the arts and humanities are shifting as a result of emerging technologies or socio-political conversations, or the fact that arts and humanities core curriculum is still overwhelmingly white and male and colonial, I believe that the survival of the arts and humanities is hinging on our capacity for evolution, for care and for community, and for intervention and family ties and relations, and for the collapse of traditional academic disciplines or methods, and also for our capacity to acknowledge our shortcomings and our trauma and our elitism. And this is also why I think about approaching this topic from a position of non-innocence is really important. And this is something I talk about so much in my PhD research. Because when we have like revolutionary ideas or radical ideas or disruptive or challenging ideas, they can be practices, they can be methods, they can be approaches. A lot of the time they start out really radical and cool and then get institutionalized. They get welcomed by an institution and co-opted and instrumentalized towards the opposite ends. They get stolen from the communities they're for and then reinstated against those people through very insidious systems of power. So it is our responsibility as artists, as institutional leaders, as educators, as researchers, to know that we do have the subconscious capacity to reinstate and reproduce the violences that we say that we work against. And it's not just about using certain tactics of political or artistic resistance, but safeguarding them. The question of safeguarding, I think, is really huge, and positing non-innocence as a starting point for taking action, especially those of us working in any sort of institution. So, okay, where do we go from there? What can this actually look like in action? What does a polydisciplinary community engaged orientation look like? Community dreaming. So I'd like to call this last section of my talk community dreaming, in which I propose some interesting ways where I personally see possible avenues of collaboration between the university and the wider performance community, inspired by things that I thought really worked about my own education, as well as some of the community engaged work I'm doing right now. Because I do want to leave this on like a productive note, on a note where we think up possibilities after all this trauma talk, which I think is really important. So here are some polydisciplinary ideas that I had, avenues of connection that emphasize kinship and outputs beyond the academy and community engagement. Maybe this is some starting points that we can think about at our round table. So one, partnerships between student researchers and community artists working towards presentations of work. I mean, I wonder what a program that pairs, let's say, arts and humanities researchers with community artists looks like, whether it's them researching historical resources for, let's say, an upcoming production that helps a rehearsal process, or an artist at the TAP Center working towards an upcoming exhibition. I think there could be some really cool ways that we could get students out of the classroom and leverage their skills for community engaged work, especially because we're trained rigorously in research skills. Why not use them for the community? Good question. I'm also thinking about arts and humanities work in co-op placements for fourth years wanting hands-on experience with different cultural institutions. I know that there are students that do stuff with WordsFest or Museum London. I know the Grand obviously is a big institution. It might be cool to have this kind of opportunity for students. Also, more opportunities for community engaged learning. And this is where I get to drop Kim Solga because she's not here. Some of my favorite classes in undergrad were taught by Kim, who is the head of theater studies, I believe, here, which involved us going out into the community and seeing shows and talking to artists and doing workshops and taking the critical conversation out of the academy and into the community. And honestly, those were some of my most valuable learning experiences, actually seeing what people are creating here now locally. I also have the idea of student workshops, not guest lecturers, but performances. Theater studies, I think, has done this in the past when I was a student way back when, with artists like bringing in Mina Samuels as a director. But I don't know, like bringing in local directors or designers or actors into classrooms to do like guest sessions with students might be cool, almost like mini workshops where they learn to think of the texts that they're studying or the processes of making theater in a different way. I think that would be really cool. And theater studies already get students to do monologues or put on mini performances, which was so much fun. I had a lot of fun doing that in Joe Devereaux's class, who's over there. But involving local artists in that might be really cool and a way to facilitate more conversation. And on the flip side of that, yeah, students presenting work publicly, accountably to the community. I thought about students doing public presentations of their own work at something like TAP or Words Fest, events that would be relevant to the community, because there's often a lot of really interesting student research that, like I said, just gets kind of fed back into the academy. And it would be really cool for people in the community to actually see what students are researching, especially if it has to do with London. I also have rejigging learning outcomes of arts classrooms. I've had this too in my undergrad education, but I think it's cool in a traditionally academic classroom to have maybe open-ended assignments for possible creative outputs. Dr. Alan Perrow did this when I was an undergrad. Students could draw up creative responses to high theory, to high philosophy, things that they're studying on a syllabus, which is really useful because it gets you thinking about high theory in practical and sometimes artistic terms, which we don't get to do a lot. And as someone who wholly believes that practice is always a logical next step to theory, and that also that art isn't just aesthetic, but also theorizing, I think that would be useful. And it also draws on the so what of high theory. And that's always the question is, we read all this cool philosophy, but what does it mean in our bodies, in our world? And that might be a cool way of bridging that. I've said cool so much, but I do think this stuff is cool. And then I also was thinking, you know, the idea of paying professional artists well for partnership opportunities, co-funding initiatives, sponsoring artist in residence programs, maybe, and giving back to London, which is to say allocating some of the university's resources to giving back to the community and championing initiatives that are duly educational for the students, but also helpful and useful and lucrative to the artists and to the community. And that I think needs a deep conversation. So those are just 6 ideas, but really there's kind of infinite possibilities here. But how do we go from community dreaming to community action? I feel like this is kind of the question that we're all going to be asking ourselves today. Well, first of all, I think events like this are kind of a great start. There are people from the university here, from the community, from many different arts institutions, talking to each other and listening. I think that's a big thing. I also think that any sort of implementation of a new kind of curriculum, which is open to some of the ideas that I presented today, requires deep, careful, ethical considerations for the needs and the values of the community as well as the academy. And again, starting from a place of acknowledging the hostile relationship between us and the trauma we've both faced as a result of the ongoing pandemic. You know, looking at the rest of the schedule this afternoon, it does look like there's a lot more opportunities for community dreaming and maybe for taking some of these imaginaries and setting concrete steps towards action, which is a great place to start. But as for my own conclusion, in terms of facilitating conversation around the arts, the academy, and the community, and specifically in this, I don't want to say post-COVID because we're still in COVID, but ongoing COVID recovery, I don't think there are perfect answers to any of these questions. And as we work towards community building and support, I think we need to recognize that we are doing so imperfectly, but to the best of our abilities, hopefully. But committing to action and recognizing our imperfection and sometimes our ignorance of how the other side sees things is so much better than just outright refusing to act or saying that it's too hard. So that's what I hope to have left you with today. I've talked for too long, but yeah, I hope that you've all gotten something from this that you can take forward to the rest of today and maybe to your own institutional practices. Thank you so much for listening. I believe there's a Q&A now, but thank you so much. This has been awesome. And thank you, Josh, for inviting me and for letting me, well, I didn't ask you if I could use your picture on that slide, but for appearing on that slide.
Most welcome to
Surprise.
Thank you so much for such a brilliant talk. We do indeed have time for questions. In order for people in Zoom land and for the video afterwards to hear you, you'll need a microphone. So anybody want to kick us off with a question for Camille? Oh, I see a hand. One sec. I'm going to do my Phil Donahue and run.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious about your thoughts. I mean, when you went to RADA, for example, you likely would have experienced this, as I did in my training in theater. But the fundamental difference is in the recognition of informal versus formal training, experiential versus the objective outcomes of what we see in the academy as a basic dichotomy. And I'm wondering how you think that can be addressed as the beginning place of that trauma. There's an apprenticeship kind of model that happens in theater school that's both abusive and positive.
Yeah.
But as performing artists, that's our experience. And my experience in trying to create programming in academia has been to objectify that, to make it objective driven. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that as a basis to move into where you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question, isn't it? So it was central, not RADA, but close enough.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a long question. I'm just trying to organize my thoughts here for a second. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of experiential learning, I think it's hard because even when you facilitate an institutionally sanctioned, let's say, field trip out into the community or something to get a group of students out to do something outside of the walls of the academy, it still is an institutionally sanctioned experience, right? Like it still is an institutional thing. And I've done a lot of workshops where I've had students ask me, what were some of your best and most formative learning experiences? And I just say, like, get the F out of the classroom. I remember when I was a student, I used to sometimes skip class to do workshops, this is bad, me saying this, I don't know. But, I think that the institution can and should facilitate some of that. But also it's this question of like, then it is still then an institutional thing and has to grapple with its own politics. So I don't know, it's sort of a catch-22 impossible question, but I do think that even introducing students to different community groups and organizations that they can then go to afterwards, like as different resources to see different things, I think would be useful. Just because, I mean, even especially with Western, where there's such a stark divide between, the Western bubble, as it was called when I was a student here, and the London community, there are a lot of people who have never taken a 2-bus down to the Palace Theatre to see something. And I don't think that choice is made. I don't think that people know that sometimes these community groups exist unless they Google it themselves or go out. Whereas if there was more ongoing conversation, they would at least know that some of these things exist, because I do think that's an issue, that students maybe don't know what's out there. But yeah, like I said, I think it's complicated because any institutionally sanctioned learning experience will be an institutionally sanctioned learning experience, but to create webs of conversation between students and people in the community, I think is always going to be valuable, so that they can go and do things on their own as well.
Hi,
I feel like I'm at a roast for some reason.
So as a community artist, how would you recommend cutting through all the red tape that would be involved to like have an association with the university? Or
I think it's kind of on, I'm saying us as somebody who works within a university, I think it's kind of on us. And a partnership that I saw that was really successful was, as somebody who works and studies at the University of Toronto currently, they did an artist residency program, I believe in collaboration with Canadian Stage and the BMO lab at U of T, which is a part of the Center for Drama Theatre Performance, where they do a lot of like work with emerging technologies. And they paid to have 2 professional artists that they chose through a selection process come in and learn about making work with emerging technologies in this lab from researchers who are also like working with performance. And so I think those kinds of collaborations are awesome, but because the university is largely the one with the resources, I think it does have to start here, which is why my talk was quite university focused. And also just, yeah, as somebody who comes from both sides, But I also understand that it's precarious because, you know, there are some departments that have a lot less resources than others, and specifically in non-STEM factions that can be difficult. But I do think that the university should open its doors more.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think I can take away a lot of like useful, valuable messages with me today.
Well, thanks for saying that.
I'm a third-year PhD student in the Center for Study of Theory and Criticism. I'm really interested in artistic expression as a way to translate my theoretical works into a more accessible ways. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about serializing through arts.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, when I was an undergrad, I remember my philosophical focus or love was the post-human. I was a big post-human girly. I took all of Jonathan Bolter's classes, for those of you that know Western professors. Dark, brooding, Freud-loving man who spoke very seriously about Sigmund Freud and Nietzsche. I actually loved his classes. But I remember I would always come away and thinking, okay, but what does the post-human look like materially or in a performance space? Yeah, I think what I had to do was just get my hands on different technologies and materials and start playing with them. I think that play is such an important thing that artists talk about a lot, but that academics sort of don't talk about a lot because it's seen as unserious. But I think when we're trying to understand high concept philosophical or theoretical ideas on a material level, yeah, I think you just kind of have to dive in nose first and think about what the importance of making it material means to you. And I feel like it's hard talking in generalizations because I don't know specifically what your research is on, but yeah, I think play is the way forward in all of that. I think finding ways to also just make it interesting for yourself. Because if it's genuinely interesting to you, it'll be interesting to other people.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And I'm going to just put on my academic hat for a second.
Please.
Over the years, I've witnessed so many PhD defenses in the public lecture that's done before that. You just gave one of the finest public lectures before a dissertation that I've ever had the pleasure of watching.
Oh my God!
I can be pretty tough. Now I know there are a lot of other academics.
Tell that to my supervisor.
Well, I will. Well, here's a message I have for your supervisor.
Okay.
You've got it. You started with your methodology. You started with the thesis. Wow, thank you for doing that at the beginning of your discussion. Then you went through your methodology and you did a very critical appraisal of sort of like the Western colonial types of research dichotomies that we're trying to break through if we're in various different, critical paradigms. And you did that, and you showed some of the literature, and then you brought it into sort of a very, very sort of factual research-based this discussion of what's going on in the community. And then at the end, you gave some conclusions that actually open up a full research program. And what you've done this in a way that I think is portable to other disciplines in terms of your critique of the prevailing methodologies. So my message for you and my message for your advisor is you're ready, get done, get out there. You're just getting this license to be an academic if that's where you're going to go. But like, you've got it.
Thank you. That's very generous. Thank you for saying that. I have written next to none of my dissertation, so I don't think it'll be that easy for me, but thank you very much. Thank you. That's really nice.
Hey, I apologize in advance if I missed something. I miss things all the time, just how I am. But I'm just wondering if you could, I don't know, define or illustrate what a community artist is compared to a non-community artist. Because technically all artists are in a community, even if you're a non-community artist. So just kind of wondering like how you would define that. And also in relation to what like community engaged artist is. So, what's community artist? What's non-community artist? Are we all just artists? And what does that mean when you talk about community engaged art? Thanks.
I mean, for me, for the purposes of this talk, I mainly used it to distinguish between like artists who work specifically within universities and artists who work specifically within non-academic settings. Although I think there's a lot of complications within that, because there are also artists working primarily within bigger, larger institutions like the Grand Theatre versus more ad hoc collectives in the London community, so that you can't really put an umbrella term over that. But I believe that the nature of being an artist is to be in community, either with other groups of artists that we're working with or with the public who are presenting work to. And sometimes I think that academics were alone in our little ivory tower of, like I said, Freud and Nietzsche and all of our favorite philosophers, white men. It's true. And we don't find ways of talking to the public or to the community in any which way. And I think that's one of the biggest issues facing the liberal arts and humanities disciplines, is that we don't actually value being community engaged. We value publishing in journals that are not open access, that people can't read. You know what I mean? It's just, we have different standards of excellence and different values. And so I think that's where I sort of see like community art or artists versus like academics who like being in academic spaces. And I just think that we should, in the academy, we need to talk more publicly and think about research outputs that are beyond just dissertations that go onto shelves and don't get opened.
Yes. Hi, Camille. Thanks very much for your awesome talk.
Thank you.
Yes. I have a question. I wonder what your experience is with an institution like Western, as far as the difference between curriculum with limited fine arts and conservatory type of classes, like creative writing classes, versus I understand you have you took that type of program in your master's degree.
Yeah.
And how that affected students' interaction with the community from the creative standpoint. Just comparing it to the US has a lot of creative writing programs, fine arts programs. In my opinion, Canada's a little bit behind there. So I wonder if you could comment on that aspect, and how far did your Western training without that fine arts conservatory type of focus prepare you for community engagement? Did that make sense with the question?
Yeah, and honestly, I could go on for like half an hour as a response to this question.
Yeah, please do. Thanks.
I won't do that. But talk to me after. But yeah, I think what's strange about sort of my educational journey is that I did a very traditionally academic bachelor's here, and I wasn't even involved in writing classes. I think I took one, but to be honest, I don't know. And maybe this is because my friends say it's because you're an Aquarius. I don't know what that means, but I'm not good with kind of like structures for me to be creative inside. And I think that sometimes what these classes do without meaning to is they foreclose the possibility of play before you even know what you're writing. Like, I think to get a grade on something, to be academically graded on a creative output, when you're really just figuring out what this idea is, and sometimes that idea can be quite personal to you, and sometimes there's a lot of really interesting value in that specific idea, but because you have to get an assignment in at a certain time and get it graded in a certain way, your relationship to that thing changes and becomes strained. Like, that was personally my experience with writing classrooms. I had to learn how to write outside of the classroom. I had to learn how to write by honestly participating in community workshops and play reading series, and not being in the classroom, like specifically to my practice as a playwright. And then when I did my master's at a conservatory in the UK, I was really excited because I was like, oh, I can, I'm now in this perfect space where academia and scholarship and art come together in these really exciting ways. Wow. But then, as I said in my presentation, I didn't feel like a proper artist or a proper scholar when I was in that space, just because of the way I feel like it pedagogically worked against my creativity, to be honest. And like I said, passion and play, two really important things to me, things that don't really exist in truest form within an institution. So I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult. In terms of my training at Western, like I said, I actually really, really loved my bachelor's. The reason I'm here speaking today, I really enjoyed my bachelor's education. I really enjoyed a lot of theater performance studies classrooms because I thought that department specifically was focusing on like non-traditional academic outputs. I learned things by directing. I learned things by performing in those classes. I learned things by talking to artists in the community making work. I learned valuable things in those classes that then translated to when I got outside of them. And I think more of that would have been awesome. But yeah, I think writing is a whole other beast. I think everybody learns how to write differently. As for me, I think just gotta live. You just gotta get out of institutions in general and go have fun and go to St. Patrick's Day party instead of going to Museum London. That's my answer.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm sorry if I don't know if I'll be able to get this out properly, but my thoughts about this are like, I'm someone who didn't get my BA. I have 1 year of university from Western from I think it was 1981 in general arts. And I didn't finish. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But my thoughts about this is that you talk about you mentioned the institution all the time. Well, there's the hospital's an institution. Western is an institution. I mean, that's something that's in place, and I think it's really important to be positive about things and think about like, okay, well, what is your role as an artist? What are you looking for? Are you looking for recognition and money? Like, what is the role of art? And my thoughts are about the kids. The whole world is in pain. We've been through terrible, terrible things and continue to in parts of the world. And I read about the children in our own communities who have so much anxiety and problems. And how could my thoughts, like I said, I don't know if I'll get this out right. Don't mean to offend anyone, but how can we give back? And you've mentioned how much you learned from just doing things in the community. Like, what about, that's my thoughts about it. Like, give back to the community, give an arena or something for children to dabble with arts while they're young, I don't know. And, there's institutions and orphanages where kids like don't even get their diapers changed. Like, I don't really get all this bashing the institution. It's accept it. It's an institution. So what is your role in it? What do you have to offer other people? Rather than complaining or criticizing, what can you do to give back to the community? And look at how far you've come from things you've done in the community. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of responses to that question, to be honest. I think I completely understand what you're saying about, I mean, being positive and being optimistic, so long as we're working within institutions and leading towards hopefully changing them or using them to do good in some way, shape, or form. But I think the reason that I wanted to take this sort of traumatized, talking about trauma angle is because institutions, specifically arts, institutions, universities, like have been sites of pain, have been sites of oftentimes racism, oftentimes sexism, oftentimes homophobia, oftentimes, regurgitating colonial, patriarchal, capitalist standards. And if we are thinking like towards a utopian, community-minded future, I don't really think that we can do that without acknowledging the ways in which institutions and certain structures societally have pained us, have hurt us. I think that that's a part of accountability that is really important, at least to me in my practice. And that's why I talk about non-innocence as a starting point for action. I think that it's really wonderful to dream and be utopian, but I think it's also I think that sometimes when we do that within institutions, like I said earlier, ideas can be co-opted by an institution and used against people that they're for, or sometimes ideas can be stolen from their more radical potentials and then again used against people in the community. And we see this a lot, specifically within the academy and with circulations of knowledge and research. So I think that's my sort of core complication. So it's not that I'm pessimistic. It's, as a matter of fact, I would love to see Lovelace's polydisciplinary institution in play. But But like I said, I don't think that we get there without deeply reckoning with the structures that are in play that have been harmful. And I think that's part of a much larger conversation around reconciliation, around the work that we as citizens and as a country need to do to reckon with our past. And so I think it's, I think it's all sort of part of the same conversation.